This is a Mule by Farid Mehr, CPM 121 Rex. Mule just meaning it's a knife designed to evaluate or test the steel, not so much in and of itself to be a functional, useful design, or at least that's the way it's often used. I don't normally think that's a sensible way to approach evaluation, because unless you have a design which is inherently functional, how can you test the function of the steel? And that's one of the problems that I had with this knife. Now, to start off, have the respect to someone like Mehr who's using steels on the extreme end of extreme. 121 Rex is a carbide tooling replacement. That means it's used when carbide tooling is too brittle, but traditional high-speed steels like M4 don't have enough wear resistance or hot hardness. So this steel, 121 Rex, is designed to blend in between the two of them, offer superior hardness, red hardness as well in particular, and abrasion resistance than traditional high-speed steels, but improved toughness over carbide tooling. The first problem I had when I got this knife, and thanks to Francis for allowing me to finally have a look at it, because I've been looking at this for some time, is that as a knife the design is relatively poor for a number of reasons. Now, I have lots of mules from various different sources, and when you get a mule like this, and this is from Collie Harris CKC knives, yes, part of it is evaluating the steel, but part of it is all a number of relatively interesting aspects that he tries to bring into design, so you have a look at that as well. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. That's the idea of trying new designs and making sort of mule or test patterns. Some of the features are extensively used in other knives, such as this patented fish scaler, as I believe Bruce first called it, which is basically an indexing point or control. This one has basically an upturned blade, which is often found in knives used for preparing poultry in the kitchen. One of the things that I notice quite strongly is when you're doing utility work, the upswept blade keeps the knife from trapping material. Now, often you want it to trap material. When you're cutting and slicing ropes, you do, hence the recurves. But on some material, you don't want it to trap, like cardboard, because it will cause the cardboard to bunch up and bind in a cut. And the upswept blade keeps it cutting very smoothly. Scallop there for the thumb ramp for indexing. Very nice knife. The only thing that I didn't like is the indexing points that he put right here, which was to lock it into the sheath, and he took this out on some other designs, some later ones that he had. But again, this is a very strong issue of personal preference, because it's how you hold the knife. And I hold it this often up around this in a side pinch grip, and I just find these to be a bit too prominent, and I just sanded them down a little bit, and I probably will do more in the future. And this is part of his sort of micro line. This was usable right out of the box. Geometry, cutting ability, all very high. This one wasn't. It didn't come very sharp at all, and I don't mean like it couldn't treetop here. I'm talking about functionally very sharp, as you wouldn't be able to cut paper very effectively with it. And if you do a bit of search on some mules, you can turn up this as a common complaint. The edge is just relatively roughly formed. That raises an obvious question to me. When you're talking about making a knife for the specific purpose of evaluating a steel, and it doesn't come really sharp, the first thing the user has to do is obviously sharpen it in order to get it to the point where they can evaluate the steel. And again, thinking of it from a testing perspective or an evaluation perspective, that's kind of silly. And even to me begs the question of, how does the maker possibly evaluate steels if he can't get a knife that sharp? The other thing is, you'll see it's very thick stock. Now, with experimental steels, steels that are not normally used for knives, that's often something you have to deal with, because again, This steel wasn't developed as a cutlery steel. It probably isn't easy to obtain in the thin stock that you would want for a knife designed for cutting. You definitely don't want to use 121 Rex as a chopping tool, although Farid does, go figure, because it has relatively low toughness and it has no properties that would make a good chopping knife. Anyway, so he is limited in terms of the stock thickness anyway. But the grind he put on it was a partial height flat grind, and it came to a relatively thick edge and a relatively high edge angle. Now, I later zeroed this, it didn't look like this initially. But again, think about that now. You have a steel, okay, which has relatively low impact toughness. And again, it's designed to be tougher than carbide. Carbide is extremely fragile, so it's only tougher than something extremely fragile. It doesn't have the toughness of even normal high-speed steels, and no one regards them as tough. So it's obviously not a knife that you're going to be used for prying and hacking and chopping. It's a knife that's designed, or the steel anyway, you're going to want to make a knife that cuts very well. But this doesn't, because it's ground too thick. So again, I couldn't evaluate the steel because it wasn't very sharp. I couldn't do an evaluation of the steel because the grind was too thick. I mean, the grind should have came like this. This is another knife from Farid Harris, and it's a prototype, mixing a bunch of blends. This is not supposed to be here. This is just basically a handle which was designed for another blade, and then he just put this blade in it because I wanted to have a look at this steel. That's not actually a design constraint. But anyway, you can see this is a full zero grind, and it's maintained with a micro bevel. This is how you evaluate a steel for cutting ability, edge retention, and ease of sharpening and grinding. So, first thing I had to do was zero this grind. I did a little bit of work on it with a belt sander, mainly because I wanted to see what a very cheap aluminum oxide belt would do. And I had no problem. I just played with it for around 10 or 15 minutes, just working the primary bevel, mainly just get a feel for if the belt cut in how hard it was to work. And I easily brought the edge down in the range of 10 to 15 thou behind the edge, which is where I wanted to get it. At that point it starts to become functional as a cutting tool. And I didn't want to go below that anyway because I never want to hit the edge when I'm power sharpening. And you never do unless you want to actually use coolant. But again, I wasn't sharpening, I mainly wanted to do that just to check to see if it could be ground on cheap belts, and the answer is yes. It didn't obliterate the belt either. So claims of its impossibility to grind are a bit exaggerated, because again, I'm grinding in the as hardened state now. You shape the knife when it's annealed, obviously. I then took it and I full zeroed it on a normal waterstone. I was using a Bester 700, which I've been doing a lot of work with recently. That's a stone not even meant to sharpen high-speed steels. It easily caught the steel and ground it back down to zero. Now, it did take a fair bit of time, and there's more details on this and some of the links in the description. But it sharpened it down, no problem, and had no problem getting it sharp, easily far sharper than it came initially. So again, there's no need to use diamonds, there's no need to use cubic boron nitride, vastly exaggerated claims. It's easily worked, no problem on regular stones. Should you use diamonds to sharpen? Yes, I would argue that you should, because of the carbide volume and a number of other reasons. It's just nicer to use, but you can use it, regular stones. Okay, so we get past all that. All the preparation done, we start doing some work. So I start doing stock comparisons on cardboard, just doing some slicing. The performance is right where I would expect it, which is actually relatively low. Why is it relatively low? Because of the edge thickness, which is minimal on this. It's essentially full zero, so the micro bevel is the only secondary edge bevel. So, well, I mean micro bevel is in true micro, that you can't see it, so it's less than 20 microns wide. And the edge angle that I'm using is relatively small. It's between 14 to 16 degrees per side. It's freehand, so it's a little bit of slop in it, but somewhere around 15 degrees per side on a 600 DMT stone. And the edge retention is in the part of the steels where they're starting to trail off. So it's below steels like M4 and LMX, and S30V, which tend to be about the maximum for this particular type of edge retention, which is slicing cardboard with a very particular finish and very particular edge angle. And the interesting thing is, as you go underneath those steels in terms of carbide volume, you do get a reduction in edge retention, but as you go over those steels in carbide volume, you also get a reduction in edge retention. So it's kind of interesting, and the reductions happen for two very different reasons. As you increase the carbide very, very much higher over like LMAX and S30V and M4, the edge no longer has the stability to hold those carbides in place, and you get blunting by fracture. And that happens with 10V, S110V, S125V, 15V, and this. And I'm also getting a knife made out of Maximet by Jeremy McComb. I assume it's going to happen to that as well. So to get these steels to have very high edge retention, you need higher edge angles to hold the carbides in place. So as a first run, after all the work was done on it, it gave me another data point to again confirm the pattern that I'm seeing, that with the particular geometry that I'm using slicing cardboard, edge retention is peaking around the sort of LMAX, S30V, M4 region, which is kind of interesting. Overall on the design, it's kind of an interesting design. Moving away from the steel for a bit and just talking about the knife, it's a knife that I sort of almost have a love-hate relationship with, not to use sort of emotionally invested terms, but it's a knife that at points I'm very, very happy with and then almost instantaneously displeased with at the exact point. Like for example, it looks pretty much like a small chef's knife. So you take it into the kitchen. It has a relatively flat handle profile, which is not that great. Everything is extremely squarish on the handle. This wasn't done by Farid Mehr. It was done sort of by one of the knife pimpers. But works relatively well in the pinch grip. It has a very nice profile. You would think it'd work relatively well in the kitchen. But the problem is, again, the blade is way too thick. And even with a full zero grind on it, you can't even make horizontal cuts through onion. You just simply can't get the knife through it. So it's again much more of a heavy wedge type shape. But again, the part is, the only thing you use heavy wedge type shapes for this for is either to get you that leverage popping stuff apart as a splitter, or to give you the weight for a chopper or the strength for a prying tool. None of these you would want to use this knife for. So the design is completely inconsistent. But again, props to Farid Mehr for making a mule out of it. The only thing I would have liked is, man, thin it out. You could have put a very high primary grind up here, like hollow, and then transitioned it down here if you didn't want to run full hollow because fear of scalping the edge out massively. Get rid of all this steel with a hollow grind up here, and then transition, and you'd have a knife that cut relatively well, relatively easy to maintain because you didn't have to remove that much material from it. And of course, put a distal taper on it, man. For the love of God, thin it out so you had a functional tip that you could do some work with. And then get rid of all this mass in the handle, hog off all that steel, put a nice tapered tang on it, and you'd have a relatively nice knife, good utility pattern, very functional. Even if the steel didn't completely blow you away, you still had a nice functional pattern in the knife. Again, that one. It's another one from Collie Harris from his Micro Hiker line. Even if the steel on this isn't absolutely great, even if the steel doesn't blow you away, you're still left with an extremely functional knife that has a wide range of applications. Very nice, very versatile. Only thing that I'm still sort of on the fence about with this is the way Collie does the drop blade right here to protect essentially your hand, because if the sharpened edge went all the way back to here, you're almost certainly going to come in contact with it. And you'll notice people who use knives like that, because they end up with all these little nicks right here on their fingers from coming in contact with the blade. I understand why he's doing it. It's a very nice solution for a number of reasons. It gives you, again, that clean sharpening point where you'll always stop back there. Protects you because it gives you that secondary hump going up against it. There's something about it that just doesn't appeal to me that I haven't quite narrowed down yet. But it is a very elegant solution for a number of applications, and he has a little snub nose point on this. So again, when I'm evaluating this, steel's actually performing relatively well on this. But even if it didn't, I'd still have a very functional design, very elegant knife, which performs very well over a broad amount of applications. If the steel doesn't work well on this, I have essentially nothing, because the design itself isn't that great. As I said, it's very inconsistent. So again, props to the man for using steels that most people won't even consider. I just wish that when it was made, much more attention was given to the fact of what am I trying to actually bring out in this steel. What kind of design would be best suited for evaluating that? Because almost everybody who gets these mules is having to do a significant amount of work to regrind it. Most people are actually just putting a very low edge angle on it because they're shying away from regrinding the primary, but it's not that big of an issue. I did it with a normal bench stone, so just put your big boy pants on and grind it down. You'll end up with a much better knife. That's much easier to maintain because, of course, now all you got to do is sharpen this little tiny bevel on the end. You don't need to try to sharpen a very wide fat bevel on the knife. I am going to relatively shortly change the way I do some cardboard cutting and do another table where I use a much higher edge angle and I use a much higher finish. I don't think I'll combine both of them in the same table. I might, but the increased edge angle will move the maximum point further along to the higher carbide seals, and it's going to be kind of interesting to me to see at what edge angle, for example, do steels like 10V and S110V significantly outperformed LMAX and S30V. I'm assuming at 20 degrees per side there should be a significant shift, and at 20 to 25 degrees per side the high carbide seals definitely then should dominate because they'll have no problem with edge stability. My problem with doing that is it's interesting from an academic perspective, but from a functional perspective, who cares? If I have to sharpen a knife at 25 degrees per side in order to get it to stay sharp, not tremendously interested in that knife, because I'll simply go back to one of the other knives like this that I can sharpen at 10 to 15 degrees per side. So even if this one stays sharper at 25 degrees per side, the cutting ability will be so much greater at this one at 10 to 15 degrees per side. It's a moot point if 121 Rex has a stability at 25 degrees per side. I'm never going to sharpen this at 25 degrees per side, and they cut exceptionally well at 10 to 15 degrees per side when you get a very high edge stability steel. But from an academic perspective, from a learning perspective, it's interesting to see where those angles are going to come out. So that's a bit of brief commentary on Farid Mule, and again, thanks to Francis for giving me a chance to look at this, because it's a steel I've been interested with for quite some time. And thanks to Ron at Carpenter for getting me a piece of Maximet, and appreciation to Jeremy McCullen for willing to grind a knife out of that, which is not going to look like this. It's actually going to be a functional knife that I can use, and that'll be interesting to explore as well.